Well, thank you all so much for joining us. This is the fourth and final of our spring webinar series featuring the work of alumni from the Field Naturalist and Ecological Planning program. We are recording these, hence my introduction here. My name is Hannah Phillips. I'm on the board of the FNEP Alumni Association. And as I said, this is the fourth and final of our spring webinar series. For those of you who are not familiar with the Field Naturalist and Ecological Planning program, we call it the FNEP program. It's a graduate program at the University of Vermont that since 1983 has recruited students with the moxie to break new environmental ground. Simply put, the mission is to develop the next generation of conservation leaders. Our graduates are sought after leaders in stewardship, conservation, policy, ecological planning, and place-based education, and whether they go on to work in boardrooms or bogs, field naturalists and ecological planners stand out as holistic problem solvers. Over 90% of alumni of the program have careers in the environmental field, and nearly half go on to lead major conservation initiatives in public, private, or nonprofit organizations. But as we approach nearly 40 years of the Field Naturalist program, we realized that with alumni working in 30 states and 7 countries, we had a yet unexplored opportunity to strengthen this network of conservation practitioners around the world. We formed the Alumni Association in 2017 with a goal of reconnecting alumni from the program and to the work that we're all doing around the world. Our hope is that by building this alliance of modern conservation practitioners, that we can encourage collaboration to confront the environmental challenges of our time. Since our founding, we've organized conferences and gatherings in Vermont on an annual basis. However, it took the global pandemic to push us into the online sphere, out of our comfort zone. But we're happy to be here because it allows us to engage our alumni who live further afield. As I mentioned, this is the fourth in a series. Hopefully you were able to join us for some of the others. If not, we're really glad you can join us tonight, and we hope to be able to do more of these in the future, so there will be more opportunities. Our talk tonight is with Jessie Griffen of the Oregon chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Jessie works as a restoration ecologist, and the title of her talk tonight is Breaking the Cycle, the Race to Restore the Sagebrush Sea. And I'm gonna turn it over to Jessie.
Thanks everybody for your time. Really excited to see you. Really excited to share my work with you, which I will attempt to do right now, sharing my screen. I'm gonna start out with a prompt for the crowd. What images come to mind when you think about Oregon? Close your eyes for a second and think about Oregon. What comes to mind for you? And you can enter answers in the chat box if you want to. You can chat them out loud if you want. I'll give you just a couple seconds to think about Oregon. Any thoughts? Any images?
I can read the chat box. Anya said waterfalls and Douglas firs. Dean says beautiful seacoast. Sonia says starry skies. Andy and Emma say the Snake River, dry and scrubby, big.
Yeah, you guys were baited, Andy and Emma. Well.
Dean Wong says Portland food scene. Andy and Emma, dry and wet. Bill, high desert to Pacific forest.
Awesome. Yeah, great. So I'm trying to advance my slide and it's stuck. There we go. So maybe you thought of some images like this. Sounds like some of you did. And I thought I'd start with my own story, which is really a confession that before I moved to Eastern Oregon, I didn't really know anything about the desert in Oregon. As an admittedly pretty ignorant East Coaster, my image of Oregon was a lush green mecca full of hipsters and hippies. Think Portland food scene, beautiful coast, forest, and that is Oregon. But I was curious for how many of you an image like this one came to mind. Is that what you think of Oregon? I don't think I was alone in my vast ignorance or underappreciation of Oregon's high desert. Barry Lopez, a nature writer, remarked that the sagebrush ecosystem is one of the least novelized, least painted, least eulogized of American landscapes. He also wrote that on first glance, the country appears hopelessly bleak and unattractive, and Wallace Stegner wrote that its scenery is, quote, depressing to all but the few who have lived in it long enough to acquire a different set of values about scenery. I am lucky to have lived in it long enough to have acquired a different set of values about scenery, and I hope that I can change your minds potentially too, if you thought along the lines of Barry Lopez and Wallace Stegner. So my name's Jessie Griffen, like Hannah said. I work for the Nature Conservancy in Oregon as the Precision Restoration Project Coordinator, and I hope I can paint a different picture of the sagebrush sea for you. In 2016, 4 years ago, I graduated from the Field Naturalist and Ecological Planning program, and I had spent 10 years in the lush forests of New England. When I graduated, I moved to a small town in southeastern Oregon called Lakeview, with a population of approximately 2,300 and 93 miles to the nearest stoplight. And I distinctly remember asking Levi, whom some of you know, to tell me about Lakeview as we considered moving there. And he told me, it's the type of place where you carry a couple extra gas cans strapped to your roof. In other words, it's out there. And I really did attend my first rodeo in Lakeview, and I loved it. And for those of you who know Levi, there's the haircut and beard styling I gave him to help us fit in at the rodeo. But seriously, in some ways, there has been some culture shock moving to Eastern Oregon. Most people in Eastern Oregon ask me pretty quickly where I'm from. In these small towns, everyone knows each other. If your family hasn't been there for at least 5 generations, or in the case of the Native Americans, more like 500 generations, you're not a local here. Many people in Lake County and across southeastern Oregon have really deep ties to the land. Just before we moved to Lakeview, southeastern Oregon became nationally famous, or perhaps infamous, depending on who you ask. And although I don't want to dwell on the occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, because that story has been told many times and in many ways by other people, I do want to recall some powerful and I think pertinent words of the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. If you haven't seen her TED Talk about the danger of a single story, I highly recommend it. I first saw it when I was in grad school at UVM. She says that when we create a single story, we show a people or a place as only one thing over and over again, and that is what they become to us. Single stories reduce the complexity and richness of people and places, so there's no possibility of others being similar to you in any way. No possibility of feelings more complex than pity or perhaps confusion or disgust. No possibility of a connection as human equals. I believe we're at risk of telling a single story about sagebrush country and those who live here. Today I want to expand the repertoire of stories about rural Western America. I was pretty surprised to learn when I began working in Burns that the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, same site of the occupation, was the site of the first collaboratively developed comprehensive conservation plan. For years, ranchers, federal government agencies, the Burns Paiute tribe, business owners, and environmentalists, including the Nature Conservancy, had been engaged in the often dull and always difficult business of negotiating agreements over regional land use issues. What a different story this is than the one that most of you have probably heard about Burns, Oregon. So where exactly is the sagebrush ecosystem anyway? The sagebrush steppe is a unique ecosystem that once stretched over 500,000 square miles across North America. Today, it's shrunk to only half of its historic extent. Much of the ecosystem has been converted to agriculture, mining, energy development, or completely lost to invasive species. I'm going to talk mainly about the Great Basin portion of the Sagebrush Sea, the vast cold desert that sits in the rain shadow of the Cascade and Sierra Mountains. The sagebrush ecosystem is home to more than 350 species of conservation concern, and I'd encourage you, if you know what these species are, to go ahead and put them in the chat box. It's a little natural history quiz for you natural history nuts out there. I used this slide at a presentation I gave to 6th graders in my hometown of Baker City. I was astounded at the depth of many of the students' ecological knowledge. They absolutely schooled me on the many clues they use to distinguish mule deer from white-tailed deer, for example. This didn't quite fit with a single story I had heard in graduate school that children these days are increasingly disconnected from nature. How did these kids know so much? They grow up hunting or watching wildlife on their ranches. There's a magnificent variety of life in the Sagebrush Sea, contrary to what you may think if you've driven through Nevada going 80 miles per hour and saw only an endless, monotonous sea of sagebrush. Or if you've read Wallace Stegner's Mormon Country. I'm going to give you a little excerpt of that now. It's great writing. 3 or 4 little puddles, an interminable string of crazy, warped, arid mountains with broad valleys swung between them. A few water holes, a few springs, a few little valleys where irrigation is possible and where the alfalfa looks incredibly green as you break out of the pass. That about sums up the Great Basin. Its rivers run nowhere but into the ground. Its lakes are probably salty or brackish. Its rainfall is negligible and its scenery depressing to all but the few who have lived in it long enough to acquire a new set of values about scenery. Its snake population is large and its human population small. Its climate shows extremes of temperature that would tire out anything but a very strong thermometer. It is a dead land, though a very rich one. If you look closer, there's so many wonders of the Sagebrush Sea. And again, encourage you to put the species into the chat and we'll see how many got right at the end. I've been lucky to get to know many of them. On the bottom right, there's sagebrush that blankets much of the Intermountain West. In the top left, fire, a process that has shaped the system for millennia since the mountains rose and then the great Pleistocene lakes receded. Now at this point, you might be saying to yourself, okay, that's nice that this ecosystem is full of cute bunnies and lots of other amazing life, but so what? Who cares? Well, although it might appear endless as you drive across Nevada, the sagebrush ecosystem is disappearing fast. Much of what's happening today in the Great Basin boils down to 2 key threats, and both have to do with fire regimes that are out of whack. And I want to just pause and give a huge shout out and special thanks to Kelly Finnan, another FNEP alumni, for doing this illustration. So on the right, you can see conifer encroachment. We have pinyon and juniper encroaching in sagebrush systems where grazing has lowered fuel loads, climate is changing, and probably most importantly, fires have been suppressed for the past century. In these higher elevation, moister sagebrush sites, we're seeing wholesale ecosystem conversion from these grass shrub systems to conifer woodlands. Luckily, this is a relatively straightforward and simple problem to solve, although the scale is pretty daunting to manage. With a combination of prescribed fire and chainsaws, we have the tools to tackle this one. When I first moved to Oregon and I worked for the Lakeview BLM, I had this amazing job where I was tasked with doing the surveys in preparation for juniper removal treatments. And so I got to ride around on my ATV all day, which I lovingly named the Sage Crusher. and explore these amazing landscapes, hundreds of thousands of acres I surveyed in one summer, getting ready for these massive scale restoration projects. And at the same time, my now boss, actually Andrew Olson, was doing a study to see whether sage-grouse would come back after restoration and use these sites, and it turns out that they did. It was pretty neat work to be a part of. But like I said, land managers have tools to deal with this problem. So I'm not going to focus my talk today on conifer encroachment. Instead, I want to talk about the other end of the spectrum, the lower elevation habitats where we're seeing too much fire. And that's on the left-hand side of the illustration. So what's going on here? Well, the sagebrush ecosystem is also home to invasive annual grasses. And to give you a sense of the scale of the problem that we're talking about, there's invasive annual grasses across at least 60 million acres of former sage-grouse habitat. That's an area the size of the state of Oregon, and the state of Oregon is huge. There's 4 million acres at least that are pretty much nothing but a monoculture of invasive annual grasses. We've got cheatgrass, medusa head, and ventonata are really the top 3 that I deal with in my work, and they are fire adapted. So they come in after disturbance and they colonize, they create lots and lots of seeds, and then a fire comes and they can do it all over again. They create this really uniform layer of fuel. It's like a carpet of fuel out in the sagebrush. So we have areas that used to burn every 30 to 150 years, now burning as frequently as every 5 years. So it becomes this self-perpetuating monoculture. How did we get here? It's not a new problem. And definitely historic overgrazing played a role. So when white settlers first arrived in Oregon, they brought with them livestock, and in the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, stocking rates were far, far above what they are today. The range in some places was grazed to almost nothing, and this created a lot of space, a lot of ecological niche for cheatgrass to come in and invade. Where did it come from? It came from the steppes of Eurasia, where it was adapted to heavy grazing, so the heavy grazing didn't hurt it in this case. And at first people thought that maybe this was a good thing. It was a new type of forage for cows, but they pretty quickly realized by the 1920s, 1930s that this was becoming a conservation crisis. It's not, it turns out, the best forage for cows. When it dries out, and it dries out pretty quickly in this ecosystem, it has these sharp, pointy seeds that scratch up their mouths. So it's really only good when it's young and green. And you can really boil down the whole problem to this pretty simple slide that I borrowed from my former boss, Jay Kirby. Fire loves cheatgrass, and cheatgrass loves fire. And the scale of the problem is gigantic. So I want to give you a feel for what this is like. So we'll see if this works. Hannah, jump in if you can't see or hear the YouTube.
Okay.
I will never forget seeing this video for the first time.
Is that a wall of smoke?
Hannah, could you see that?
We could. It was,
Okay.
yeah.
Did it work okay?
It worked well. It was sort of hard to tell what it was, so.
So it was a giant wall of dust. It was a huge dust storm. And then in the video that follows, the dust storm actually overtakes their car and the kids are crying and it's dark. It's like hell on earth, essentially. It's a huge, huge wall of dust. And so what happened is in 2012, Southeastern Oregon had 3 megafires that burned a total of over 1 million acres. I think it was 1.4 million acres in 1 year of sagebrush rangeland. And so that dust storm was some of the aftermath. That was along the northern edge of the Long Draw Fire. And if you've never been in a dust storm, actually my most recent day of field work was in a dust storm, and it was not even close to the magnitude of that, but it was one of the most miserable days of field work of my entire life. I kind of wish we had taken photos, but at the same time I don't. I mean, it's in your eyes, in your nose, in your ears. Things are blowing everywhere. It's misery. And so when I see that video, I feel about as scared as this little pygmy rabbit looks. Pygmy rabbits, by the way, are one of the many wonders of the high desert. They're North America's smallest and indisputably cutest rabbit and a sagebrush obligate. But I digress. It's not just that a dust storm after a fire is a scary event. Air pollution is a major threat to health globally, and wildfires contribute to air pollution. They're expected to worsen with climate change. In a recent review of 61 studies on air pollution and wildfire, the majority of studies found that wildfire smoke was associated with increased risk of respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. And if anybody wants the citation on that, I'm happy to share it after the talk. So this is a real human health issue. It's our health that's at stake. And this smoke can travel far. I didn't include it, but there's some really cool NASA imagery. Maybe we can pull it up in the discussion if anybody wants to see from a Canadian wildfire where the smoke was funneling as far as Minnesota from British Columbia. It's absolutely wild. So these wildfires might even affect you someday. Now, every horror story needs a hero, and in this case, native perennial bunch grasses are the heroes. These long-lived, deep-rooted grasses are the key to fighting fire across the sagebrush ecosystem. They stay green longer into the season, and much of their biomass is stored underground. They tend to be spaced out rather than forming a continuous carpet like cheatgrass. So in order for fire to spread in bunch grass and shrub-dominated systems, there has to be significant wind. Now, for those of you who speak data, here's some nice data from colleagues Kirk Davies at the USDA Agricultural Research Service and Dustin Johnson of Oregon State University Extension. What they found is that the more large perennial bunch grasses you have, the less invasive annual grasses. And once the bunch grasses are established, they can resist reinvasion. So the problem's solved, right? We just plant a whole bunch of native bunch grasses. And in fact, we do plant a whole bunch of native bunch grasses and other native plants in the Great Basin and across the whole sagebrush ecosystem. To give you a sense of the scale of restoration we're talking about, land management agencies buy an average of 2 to 3 million pounds of seed for restoring rangelands every year. And yet we're still seeing a decline in sagebrush habitats, still seeing an increase in invasive annual grasses. So what's happening? In 2011, Jeremy James, Tony Svekar, and James Ranella conducted an incredibly detailed study of bunchgrass demography over 3 years at 4 different sites that had been seeded after fires. What they found mirrors what others have been finding, that the probability of successfully restoring bunchgrasses is extraordinarily low. There's a crucial bottleneck somewhere between seeds germinating and emerging. So you can see that the cumulative survival, the probability of surviving if you're a seed that gets planted in a restoration project, appears to be less than 10%. Since this study, we've been unpacking the barriers to successful restoration. Why is it so difficult to restore native perennial bunchgrasses? Like most things in ecology, the answer to the question is that it's complicated. On the one hand, they didn't evolve to successfully reproduce every year. Pulses of establishment happen when there's plenty of rain. As you can see from this graph of crop year precipitation at one of our experimental sites, precipitation is highly variable in this system. Note that most years don't fall within the average. So the average here is in the middle in that yellow zone, and those red bars are plus or minus 10% of the mean. So plus or minus 10% of the average. So most of the years don't fall within those red dotted bars. And that little gray zone, if you can see that on your screen, is an almost 20-year straight period of very few average years. So there's incredible variation in precipitation in time. And not surprisingly, there's also incredible variation in this ecosystem across space. And things like whether you're on a north or a south-facing aspect make a huge, huge difference to the survival probability of your seeds. But there's much more to the story than just a heck of a lot of variation in precipitation and in space. I'm going to use a few examples from our work to illustrate how our partners and our team are investigating the barriers to successful restoration and designing strategies to overcome or manage those barriers. We'll start with a relatively simple piece of the puzzle: competition. On the left is cheatgrass, and on the right are native perennial bunchgrasses grown for the same amount of time, part of one season. The evolutionary strategy of cheatgrass can be summed up with live fast, die young. It germinates in pulses whenever there's enough moisture and puts an absolute ton of energy into developing those incredibly annoying seeds that get stuck in your socks and are just prolific and everywhere. The native perennial bunchgrasses, on the other hand, evolve to play a long game. They develop a lot more slowly. Over time, yes, they can dominate sites and prevent reinvasion, but when they are seedlings, they're poor competitors. If you're a native seed surrounded by thousands, literally thousands of cheatgrass seedlings per square meter, I've counted them, I know, chances are you aren't getting too much of the already sparse water that you need to survive. So what can we do about that? Well, much of my lab and field work at the Nature Conservancy has focused on developing a potential solution to the problem of competition. We call the seed technology that you see here herbicide protection pellets. One of the few tools that managers have in this ecosystem to fight the invasive annual grass wildfire cycle is pre-emergent herbicide. This selective herbicide knocks back invasive annual grass populations for 1 to 3 years, depending on the herbicide. But under normal conditions, it would also knock out native seeds. So our colleagues and partners, Matt Madsen and Tony Svekar, came up with an idea, borrowed from industrial agriculture, to protect seeds by packaging them in activated carbon. That way you can seed and immediately spray herbicide. The activated carbon adsorbs the herbicide and protects the native seeds. And the herbicide knocks out the unprotected invasive annual grasses. So this gives the natives a head start to get established with drastically reduced competition. We've seen promising results with this technology in small-scale lab and field trials. Most of my work in the past 3 years has focused around scaling up the technology. One of the projects I work on is led by a colleague, Owen Boffman, and kudos to him for many of the slides and photos that I poached, and I'm about to show you. We call the experiment STEGA, or the Seed Technology Experimental Garden Array, and it's a multi-state network of Nature Conservancy field sites to test promising seed technologies. I know, another acronym, but at least you can spell this one with your bodies, almost. The current goals of STEGA are to test new seed technologies in strategically diverse and representative sites all across the Sagebrush Sea. We also want to bring in other TNC states and partners to gain momentum, resources, and learning power. When I started my job in 2017, this was pretty much just an Oregon-focused effort with a staff of about 1.5 plus 2 seasonals. In 2018, we grew significantly with the addition of a team, full-time team, and new lab in Wyoming. And we set up 3 STEGA sites in 3 states. In 2019, we set up experimental sites across 5 Western states. So we're growing pretty quickly. And this work has taken me all over the Intermountain West on some pretty big adventures. So I just wanted to give you some images of what that work looks like. Here you can see our site in the snowstorm mountains in mining country in Nevada. It's a really, really beautiful site. On the bottom right, you can see us preparing the experiment, trying to outrun the snow. We had to get all our things lined up in the hotel the night before, but we managed to do it. We did not manage to outrun the snow on our Red Canyon Preserve in Wyoming. However, it snows a lot and early there. Also a really spectacular and pretty different site. This one's not in the Great Basin. And to our great chagrin, they actually don't have that much of an issue reestablishing native perennial bunch grasses in this part of the ecosystem. Their issue is more with sagebrush. So we've been helping them develop, and they've been helping us develop technologies designed specifically for sagebrush, but that's a talk for a different day. And in the spring, every spring we go out and this is what we hope to find, our seedlings emerging from the herbicide protection pods. And as my colleague Owen likes to say, when you go out there and you do this monitoring and you're in the non-herbicide control sites, it's like trying to find a piece of straw in a haystack, not even a needle, but a piece of straw. It's crazy. Much of the work that I've led is focused on investigating scaling up herbicide protection pods to application. HPPs are showing potential in lab and field research settings as an important tool to add to a land manager's toolbox, but they're not yet commercially available for restoration practitioners to use. You can't just place an order for HPPs on Amazon. So we have this great idea in theory, and we decided to try to demonstrate it at a larger scale and investigate new, more industrialized methods of producing herbicide protection pods that could be scaled up and eventually adopted by industry. So a lot of my work has focused around this, and the catalyst for scaling up has been this Wildlife Conservation Society Climate Adaptation Fund funded project at our Juniper Hills Preserve, where we're demonstrating innovative methods to restore native bunch grasses to a sage steppe site that's identified as resilient in some climate analyses, but at greater risk of invasion as climate changes, and is already showing some early warning signs of invasion. So on the left there you see an invaded patch prior to restoration, and on the right you see what we hope to accomplish, but it'll be quite a few years before a site would look like that. It's been kind of a rocky road to scaling up, with lots of trial and error involved. And to give you a taste of that, here's an example of the kind of troubleshooting we've had to do as we scale up. We started in a lab with a stand mixer to mix our ingredients, basically a very dirty KitchenAid. And then we tried a cement mixer, and that failed completely. Then we moved to a power drill with a drywall paddle, which nearly shook my shoulder off. And finally, we landed with a mortar mixer, which actually worked beautifully for our needs. Suffice it to say, we haven't worked out all the kinks with scaling up yet, but we're steadily learning and refining the technology with our eyes always on application. So I'm going to switch to a different barrier that's preventing restoration success, and that is winter mortality. And there's a bunch of possible interacting underlying causes of this. So you've got cold-related stress and mortality, drought after germination, pathogens, or maybe it's all these things interacting. And so what can you do about this? Well, you can try to avoid the barrier. You might say, well, you know, typically we plant in the fall in the Great Basin. If you've got winter mortality, why don't you just plant in the spring? Well, this is why you don't just plant in the spring. It's pretty much a rite of passage in sage steppe fieldwork to get your trucks stuck in the mud. So enough said about why this doesn't work. So again, colleagues and collaborators came up with the seed technology that could potentially overcome this barrier. They came up with a hydrophobic seed coating, and we had a really awesome intern create this GIF for us to illustrate what's happening. So I'm going to push play, and hopefully it'll play for you. So you have your coated seeds on the left and your untreated seeds on the right, and it's wintertime, it snows, and then we get a thaw event, and the untreated seed starts to grow. Lo and behold, it snows again, and it freezes and dies. Whereas on the left, our treated seed makes it because it germinated later. It had that hydrophobic seed coating. So in a nutshell, that's how that seed technology works. And we're in the early phases of testing this. And here's a quick summary of the field research so far. So winter germination, we tested this at in Oregon, southeastern Oregon, over 3 years across 6 different site and soil aspect combinations. And what we found was that winter germination was heterogeneous. It varied in time and space, and it was present about half the time. The seed coating worked. It did what it was designed to do. It always delayed germination, but it only actually made a difference for restoration when the winter germination barrier was present. So what's next for this work? More tools are needed and a framework to decide when and where to use them. And on that developing a framework front, one of the parts of our work that I'm excited about is that we're tracking the early life stages of the seedlings from germination to emergence and establishment, and also the soil moisture and temperature data at every site in high resolution with measurements taken at 2 depths every 2 hours. And so we're feeding this data into models to better understand the conditions that lead to successful establishment. The experiment I just talked about was in southeastern Oregon. We're looking to have data now from across the sagebrush ecosystem. Here's another illustration from our awesome intern, Eric Ronstad, that just illustrates where we'd like to go, which is targeted restoration treatments and targeted seed technologies. So instead of applying a one-size-fits-all restoration approach, the same treatment over many, many hundreds of thousands of acres, you might know where a barrier to germination or to success is most likely to exist, for example, by mapping cheatgrass ahead of fire. You might know that competition would be a barrier to establishment in that particular place, and you would be able to plan to use herbicide protection pods there, but you wouldn't need to use them where competition isn't a barrier. So to close, I wanted to just briefly return to the idea of the single story. And I'm so glad that Dean is on, because Dean challenged me to always try to think bigger. I'm very much in the weeds. Literally, my job these days is to be in the weeds, to count the weeds even. And Dean always challenged me to try to think big. And so I hope I added a few more stories and a few more ideas to your conceptions about the sagebrush sea. Of course, there's many more stories out there. So I want to leave you with a challenge, and that is to challenge your own single stories. Sadly, with all of the racial injustice that has surfaced recently, I think this is more important than ever. A TNC colleague wrote recently, "We cannot have a healthy planet without diversity in who sits at the table of power, and equity in who benefits from the bounty of Mother Nature. Diversity and equity are laws of nature." Thanks so much for taking time out of your day to listen. And before we open it up for discussion, I owe a huge thanks to the amazing group of people that I work with and to our many partners. As Jeffrey Hughes would say, I robbed them blind for this presentation. I borrowed their slides, graphs, illustrations, ideas, and images, although all mistakes are, of course, my own. And bonus points to anyone who can spot the FNEP in the mix here. Thanks very much, and happy to open it up for discussion.